Chapter 17. The third day of the hunt brought a change in the fishers' tactics. The boys found where the tired animal had curled up to sleep in the lee of a thicket. From that point on, the fresh trail ran in wide, irregular circles. "He's forgot about all where he's going," said Jim, striding grimly along the track. "All he can think of now is getting away." That morning, the older boy hit a pace that made Lindsay almost trot to keep up. "I'm not going to waste 3 days and then give up without even a sight of him," he explained when his brother voiced a panting remark. "What I'm afraid of now is he's going to find a hole somewhere and we'll lose him. Gotta keep him on the run." The fisher had made a desperate swing that crossed the Porcupine not far from Jim's lower camp. Half a mile beyond, the trail led into the dense tangle of fallen trees and bush, and the boys took separate routes as usual to find the track where it emerged. When they met on the other side, Jim held up a warning hand. "Sure you didn't pass any track?" he whispered. Jim shook his head. "Then he's denned up here," the older boy announced jubilantly. He pulled Lindsay to a little distance and watched the thicket while he talked. "If he's got a hole in there, he's got us licked. The law won't let us drag a fisher or smoke him out. Only thing we can do now is set a couple of traps and go home." "He's way out of his country," the younger boy answered. "Doesn't seem likely he'll know of any hole around here unless he found it by dumb luck." "Just what I think," Jim nodded. "So here's what we can try. Take a look at that bush heap. It's pretty open all around except one place where I came through over to the west there. See that clump of little spruces? All right, if you were a fisher and the hunters came up on the east side of the thicket and made a big noise thrashing and hollering, what would you do?" "I getcha," Lindsay grinned. "Suppose you want to do the shooting long as it's your idea. All right, go get in your place. I'll be the big noise." "Remember," Jim warned him as they parted, "he's tired. Maybe he won't budge at first. Don't get discouraged. Just keep at it and make him think you're coming right in after him." Jim took his stand about 15 yards from the west side of the brush pile, half hidden by a tree trunk, and looking down his rifle barrel at the place where the fisher ought to appear. There was a wait of several seconds, and a sudden uproar broke loose on the opposite side of the thicket. Intent as he was on getting a possible sight of the game he had trailed so far, Jim couldn't repress a chuckle at the riot his brother was rising. It began with blood-curdling yells and a crash in the bush that sounded like a tree falling, then a whoop and a smashing of sticks continued for half a minute with scarce an interruption, then silence. Jim's finger was curled on the trigger, tense with impatience. What's the matter with that guy? Hadn't he told him to keep on making a noise until... Crack! Over the thicket, Lindsay's rifle broke the silence. "Hey!" came the boy's excited shout. "By golly, I got him!" With a slightly let-down feeling, Jim tramped over to the tangle of bush and looked over for his brother. "Over here," Lindsay called. "He tried to put one on over us, skipped out on the south side, the way he came in. I left my gun against a tree and had to grab it and take a quick shot. Look!" He held the animal up gloating. "Got him right through the noggin. Didn't spoil the skin." It was a big male fisher, thin and bony, but in excellent fur. "Pretty shooting," Jim admitted without any envy. "He ought to be worth $60. That's not a bad wage for 3 days' work." They settled their packs and hiked down the river. It was no use trying to make Wabing that night. The day was half gone, and there was 25 miles of heavy breaking between them and the family's camp. They plodded wearily up the stream, looking at Jim's cubbies as they went. At the foot of Porcupine Lake, Lindsay found a big snowshoe rabbit in one of the traps. "Course there isn't much meat on him," he said, picking up the frozen body. "Still, with 2 more meals to eat, we'll need all the grub we can find." They spent the night in Jim's cabin on the lake. Rabbit stew made them a spare supper, and in their packs they found enough tea and bread crust to piece together a skimpy breakfast. When the last crumb was eaten, they tightened their belts and set out through a gentle falling snow for Waba. It was a pair of hungry boys that hurried along the last few miles of the trail to the home cabin that afternoon. "Gosh," Lindsay growled, "seems as if I could chew on an old boot and like it." Yeah, Lindsay replied. Well, you can have your old boat. Me, I'm going to take a big mess of fried moose steak with mashed potatoes and hot maple syrup and hot biscuits. Stop it, moaned the younger boy. You're breaking my heart. And besides, you didn't put any deep dish apple pie. 7 or 8 inches of new snow had fallen when they finally reached home shortly before dark. The wood piles and dog kennels were blurred mounds of white, and the path to the shed door was shoveled out by the girls, was a narrow trench between 6-foot walls of snow. Miss Vanderbeck heard them taking off their snowshoes in the shed and opened the door to peer out. Well, I declare, she cried. So you did get back here at last. We thought you'd given up and gone back to your traps. Got away, did he? Lindsay pulled the fish out of his pack sack and held it up for his inspection. Doesn't look like it, does it? He said with pride. But, Ma, listen. Is supper most ready? We ain't tasted Christian food since yesterday morning. The good woman flung up her hands in horror. You come right inside, she said. Get your things off and I'll have your supper on the table in 5 minutes. My land, you poor youngsters. She bustled back to the stove and soon had a great platter of food in front of the famished pair. They ate till they could hold no more, then sat back and gave the family a detailed account of the 3-day hunt. Big Lindsay chuckled when they came to Jim's strategy of getting the fisher out of the brush heap. That's the way it always works, he says. You try and think like an animal would, and you'll find they're about 2 jumps ahead of you every time. It's lucky Lindsay's happened to see him when he ducked out. The boys spent another day at Waba before starting back to the squaw. They cut and hauled 6 sled loads of firewood, dug out the sawhorse, and sawed up the logs to stove length. Meanwhile, their mother baked loaf after loaf of brown bread. She meant, she said, to make it up to them for their recent fast. On the morning of the 11th of February, Jim, Lindsay, and Ida harnessed 1 team of dogs and took the trail north towards Porcupine Lake. They had the sled loaded with their duffel and with all the fresh baked bread they could stow aboard. The snow was too deep to move fast, but they reached Jim's home camp with half an hour of daylight to spare. It was warm that night, and a light rain made slush on the river. Jim and Lindsay had planned a trip together down the squaw, deciding it was useless to take the dogs. From now on, Jim said, it's likely to keep thawing and freezing right along. You can't use dogs when the slush ball's on their feet. Ida can take the team back to Waba, and we'll pack our own duffel. Their sister got breakfast for them and helped them fill their knapsacks. Then the dogs were harnessed, and she departed on the southbound trail. The boys put on their snowshoes and swung on their packs and started down the river. The surface had settled after the thaw and was fairly firm. They had painted their snowshoes with a concoction brewed from alder bark, which prevented the slush from sticking to the frames and woven thongs. Thus they were able to go ahead at a good pace in spite of the heavy load they carried. Jim dug down his trap houses along the way and was pleased to find 1 belated mink to add to his catch of fur. On the river, a little way above the long carry, they sighted a huge old bull moose feeding in the alders. He had shed his antlers, but his great size and bell under his throat made it obvious he was a patriarch. Half a mile further on, they saw more moose, 3 of them together this time, wading through the sodden snow. A young bull led the group, and a cow with a half-grown calf accompanied them. Look, said Lindsay. Funny thing, that one's still wearing his horns. Sure, Jim answered. He's only about 2 foot spread. Light little horns like that don't fall off as easy as the big ones. He probably won't shed for another month. They spent the night at Long Portage Lean-To and went on next day to Jim's lower camp without stopping at Beaver Lake. The only fur they found in the trap was a mink, and that had to be thrown away. It was buried so deep under snow and ice that Jim cut the skin with the axe in getting it out. Also, mice had gnawed in the hide, and several patches of fur were destroyed. When they reached the place where the cabin ought to be, Jim looked around in consternation. He thought he knew every bush and tree and bend in the river by now, but where was his camp? At last, walking closer on top of the drifts, He saw a small dark triangle under a mound of snow. A little area of logs below the peak of the ridgepole was all that showed. The rest of the shack was completely engulfed in white. Tired and hungry, the boys set to work laboriously and dug the snow away from the door. It was pitch dark before they got the cabin warm and their supper cooked. "Tell you what," said Jim, as he lay back resting after the meal was finished. "I think I'll pick up the traps down this way. There'll be mighty little fur after the middle of February, and there's too much work to make it pay. There's only 2 weeks left of the season anyway." Lindsay agreed with them. Next morning they went on down the river, springing and taking such traps as Jim had set below the camp. It was snowing lightly when they returned to Long Portage the following morning. On the trip upriver they had picked up all the traps, including those at Beaver Lake, and they were staggering into camp heavily laden with clanging steel. "The chain gang," Lindsay called them. "Guess I don't want to be a convict after all," he jested pantedly, as he flung down his load on the cabin floor. Jim looked out before bedtime to see what the weather promised. The snow had stopped again, and a few stars were struggling through the clouds. It was warm outside, barely below freezing, he thought. As he started to close the door, a faint, shivery sound came through the night. "Wolves are out," he remarked, dropping the door latch in place. "Sounds like a pack of 'em off to the south somewhere." Half a dozen times in the night he woke to hear that eerie, wild music. Never very near, but coming, it seemed, from every point of the compass. Breaking trail next day on the stretch of river between the Long Carry and Jim's home camp, the boys watched for wolf tracks. "Funny thing," said Lindsay, when they had covered several miles. "I'd have sworn I heard them coming up this way." "Me too," Jim answered. "You never can be sure, though. Unless you're outdoors, it's hard to tell just where the wolf howl comes from. Dad told me once they had a way to throw their voice. That's the fool game, I guess. Say, look at that. There's one thing they didn't kill last night." A gaunt, brown cow moose was wading knee-deep in the snow close to the bank, and even as they watched, a pair of twin calves stepped out from behind her, cocking their ridiculous great ears in the boys' direction. That afternoon, they took 3 ermine out of the cubbies, and as they neared camp, Jim found a live lynx caught by the toes of a hind foot in a No. 2 mink trap. "Sure is a good thing these cats are dumb," he told Lindsay when he had shot it. "One good pull and his paw would have come out clean as a whistle." After a night in Jim's camp, where they refilled their pack sacks with supplies, the boys set out next day for Lindsay's line, cutting north through the woods to Albalus Lake. The younger boys had traps set all along the chains upon Albalus and Loon and Sucker Lake, and by dint of steady work they came out on Squaw Lake by nightfall. One mink was all the fur they found, but the day was enlivened by the sight of a pair of caribou galloping through deep snow on Sucker Lake. Lindsay had been walking in the lead as they came down the thoroughfare towards Squaw Lake, a mile from camp. Suddenly, Jim saw him disappear. Running forward, he found the boy trying to pull himself out of an air hole through which he had dropped without a warning. He threw himself flat on the crust and pushed his snowshoes forward, giving his brother something to hold on to. In a moment, he had him out. Lindsay was between rage and laughter. "Darn brook was only a couple feet deep down there. Wet me to my knees," he said. "But that sure is a helpless feeling when you start to fall." Fortunately, the temperature was not very low. They hustled on to Lindsay's Squaw Lake camp and got a fire started before the youngsters' toes had time to freeze. The morning of the 18th broke clear and cold, a good day for travel. When the boys had followed Lindsay's trapline a few miles down the squaw, they swung to the right on an overland trail through the bush. At noon they struck Jim's route from Porcupine Lake to Waba, and before sunset the family's cabin was in sight. Miss Vanderbeck was the only one there to greet them. Big Lindsay and the girls were off on a trip to Nakina for supplies. Jim stretched his legs luxuriously under the big puncheon table. "Well, kid," he told his brother as they settled down to a meal of their mother's cooking, "let's see how much we can get done before they come back. There's spring wood to cut, nets to pull, and a couple of moose hides to fit up into snowshoe fillings, and Dad's traps to tend, and... "Hey," mumbled Lindsay, his mouth full of hot biscuits. "Quit talking about work and let me enjoy supper.